very, very painful.
The Outer Hebrides in the Western Isles of Scotland, home to around 28,000 people. But for 1 week every year, the population is swelled by 100 of Europe's top quadrathletes who come to compete in the event that the London Times recently dubbed Europe's premier adventure race, the Deep Heat Western Isles Challenge. During the event, the 13 solo competitors and 14 teams swim, cycle, kayak and run the equivalent of 3 back-to-back marathons a day for 3 days in succession, in addition to ascending the equivalent height of Mount Everest. Not surprisingly, the organisers have in the past been accused of being slightly sadistic. Namely this man, Ian Callaghan, whose brainchild the event was back in 1995. But despite the gruelling schedule, the calibre of the competitors improves every year, and this was no exception. Mark Laithwaite from Wigan, national champion quadrathlete and internationally renowned adventure racer, the odds-on favourite. Derek McCringle from Scotland, an experienced triathlete who's turned to adventure racing with great success. Paul McClintock, number 24, another Scot who knows this sort of terrain well. Chris McSweeney, well-known adventure racer, twice Salomon X Mountain winner and regular contributor to adventure racing websites. And Helen Diamantidis from Kinross, veteran adventure racer of the Eco Challenge ilk and only the second woman ever to take on the solo race. And the teams wear the Fox hat: Sean Morley, Maggie Creeber, Dermot McConigal and Adrian Davis. An impressive mix of specialist fell running, cycling and kayaking talent. The quirkily titled Fat Al and the Spirit of Van Hire team: Ian Wilson, Greg Barber, Katie Bucock and Alec Keith. Twice the bridesmaids, but on a mission to go one better. But they're likely to be pushed all the way by the wrong box no score team: Nicola Davies, Ben Bardsley, John Bargett and Keith Brown. The prologue section on the islands of Barra and Battersea marked the most southerly point of the race, which traverses 11 Hebridean islands in a northerly direction. And first up, Heval Mountain on the 7-mile run was Ben Patton of Team Patton, which consists of 3 brothers and their sister-in-law. Donald Thompson of Sulaskaya, the only local team, was next. Given an average age of 45, that's not a bad start. Soloist Mark Laithwaite pushed hard up the 383-metre mountain in a bid to make up time for an illegal navigation error that saw the sports fitness instructor docked 20 minutes. But Laithwaite was not alone. Soloist Chris McSweeney also had 20 minutes docked after following Laithwaite down the same route. Diamantidis, meanwhile, was emerging as a strong contender after setting the fastest run time regardless of navigation errors, and she was closely followed by soloist Paul McClintock. Meanwhile, Germany's Rolf Johannes was already suffering from a ligament strain that saw him pull out the next day.
Hamish McMaster, that's me, ladder. Sorry I'm a bit late, I had to sample some sheep on the way. Being from New Zealand, you know.
Meanwhile, in the team event, it was all going pear-shaped for Sean Morley of Wear the Fox Hat and Ian Wilson of Fat Owls. The 2 policemen made a 30-minute detour, but such is their standing in the sport that all but 4 of the other competitors followed them.
Yeah, I had the wrong grid reference on my map, so I ended up going to the pier I wanted to go to. The only problem was it was the wrong pier. So when we sorted that out, we ended up being 25 minutes down on the first team, which was a nightmare. It's a long race, 2 more days. We've made mistakes, the other teams are just as capable of making mistakes. So yeah, we'll just, keep going as hard as we can, keep pushing it and, waiting for them to make a mistake, unfortunately, now. But yeah, we can make the time up. Give it a go.
Sean and I were somewhat in front, and apparently Sean has marked his grid reference as being the place where we were staying last night and not the finish. And Sean and I go back some years, and his navigation is somewhat better than mine, and I argued with him, but we carried on regardless and ended up coming to a dead end, having to spin round and face the rest of the whole fleet coming towards us, bar one, who has now got 25 minutes on us.
After perfect conditions for the prologue, the mists came down on day 2, causing the cancellation of the kayak across the Sound of Barra. Meanwhile, Greg Barber of Fat Al's gathered with the other cyclists at dawn for the start of a 23-kilometre road cycle that would take them from the dunes of Battersea to the north of Barra. New Zealand's national triathlon champion Barber had set the fastest overall prologue time, only to discover that his kayaker, Ian Wilson, had lost them 30 minutes. so he was pushing hard to make up time.
Plenty of time.
Ben Patton of Team Patton, however, was working on the less haste, more speed principle. And sure enough, it wasn't long before bike specialist Ben was soon overhauling the opposition, although he was still chasing the Kiwi. First of all, though, he had to overhaul John Bargett of the Wrong Box team, who'd already moved into a narrow lead over Fat Al's. Patton eventually finished the 23-kilometre section ahead of all but the super-fast Barber.
Well, that was a pleasant thing to do early in the morning.
And with all the cyclists back in, it was time for a short ferry trip across the Sound of Barra to Ludag on the island of South Uist. And while some swapped tails, others had time to catch up on some well-deserved sleep. Back on terra firma at Ludag, details of the first mystery section of the day were handed out to the teams.
Yeah, that's not good.
But although route planning is vital in this event, Wrong Box No Score lost valuable time procrastinating over their tactics. Nicola Davis eventually got away on the 21-kilometre road cycle, but she'd already lost vital ground to front-runners Fat Al, whose Kiwi ringer Greg Barber took the opportunity to storm along the beach on the 16-kilometre mountain bike section. Meanwhile, James Allen of the Avengers, who with an average age of just 20 were the youngest team in the event, handed over to Richard Picton for a 6-kilometre kayak section. The Avengers, having a blinder of a morning, even led Sean Morley of the Fox Hat team out of the tiny port, although the top two teams, Fat Al and Wrong Box, were already long gone. On the beach at Hakluyt, Morley was judged the quickest over the water, but was still pushing all the way to make up the 30 minutes he'd lost the day before. Paul McClintock came ashore minutes later, and after a pass to refuel, was on his way again. At Loch Eufort, the closeness of the top two teams became visually apparent. As Ian Wilson of Fat Al's prepared to enter the water in his kayak, Nicola Davis of Wrong Box raced into view with teammate Keith Brown after a 5.5-kilometre run over a 347-metre mountain aptly named Evil. But within seconds, Greg Barber of Fat Al's appeared over the horizon, hot-footed it to the handover with Katie Bucock, Fat Al's resident swimmer, who'd only just had time to don her wetsuit.
It's Nicky.
Davies, who represented the UK in the high-tech finals in LA last year, used to have a job running up Helvellyn every day to check a weather station, so she's well used to this sort of terrain.
Can I take that?
And after arriving from all points west, it was in fact Fat Al's who made the changeover first, with Barber handing over a square of tweed that acts as a baton to Katie Bucock. Ahead of Keith Brown and Bucock, a 2-kilometre swim across the icy waters of Loch Eufort, accompanied only by a safety kayaker and a few inquisitive seals.
That's right.
And after a storming run over Eval, Richard Patton of Team Patton handed over to sister-in-law Kirsty and brother Simon after emerging from the hills in a clear third place. But Edinburgh's Maggie Creeber of Wear the Fox Hat, the Scottish national team quadrathlete, wasn't far behind. But sadly for Creeber and the others before her, a strengthening northwesterly wind then forced the cancellation of any further crossings. Despite this being taken into account in the timings, it didn't make it any easier to accept. Meanwhile, soloist Mark Laithwaite arrived off Eval complaining of ligament problems before setting off on a 35-kilometre road cycle section to Loch Maddie. But after overhauling him somewhere on the mountains, Superwoman Helen Diamantidis was already ahead of him on the road. And as the competitors head for day's end at Loch Maddie, we'll take a break. Welcome back to the Western Isles, where we caught up with Helen Diamantidis.
The adventure races that I've done before and that you hear about have wacky things like scuba diving and parachuting into things, which is all very well, but the idea of the Western Isles Challenge is that you traverse from one end to the other under your own steam. So you paddle the water, you cycle the roads and you run the hills, and what a lovely concept. So that's why I really wanted to do it as an individual.
After 13 kilometres at sea, Sean Morley and Ian Wilson led the rest into Loch Maddie to regain much of the time they'd lost on the prologue. but it was still too close to call at the front.
Not quite sure how I managed that.
We've had a very entertaining day, considering how far we've come. To end up within about a minute of the team behind us at the end of the day is quite tremendous.
So after a change of clothes and time for a brief cat nap, all but the kayakers boarded a ferry to the Isle of Harris. Day 3 and the sun rises over the island of Tarrantay. It's barely light and already the kayakers have paddled 15 kilometres across the Sound of Harris, as the swimmers await to change over for a 1 kilometre swim around to the adjoining bay. Considering she's barely ever kayaked, Helen Diamantidis' early arrival on the beach impresses everyone. It's an ominous sign for the rest of the field as the team swimmers take off around the bay towards the next mystery point at the summit of Chibal, some 365 metres above the beach. Nicola Davis of Wrong Box arrives in the shadow of the mountain and hands over to Ben Bardsley after deciding that it's quicker to bike the sand than to run it. Shortly after, Nigel Holt of the Badgie IO team hands over to wife Emily, as a team member looks after their 7-month-old daughter Jennifer in the team van. And as the last runners make their way to the summit, the front runners have already crossed the 3 kilometres of sand flats at Scarrister and are handing over to teammates for the 11.5 kilometre road cycle. First in, Fat Al's. Out of the way! Next in is Diamantidis, who's taken another huge chunk out of the others over the mountain. While Ben Bardsley of Wrong Box keeps his team within sight of Fat Al's as he hands over the baton to John Bargett. Derek McCrindle, meanwhile, continued his steady rise to 5th place as he crossed the flats at Scarrister Beg.
Oh, this is hot. A hard start to the morning. The tea break at work by now.
John Bargett was forced to take a brief detour while he chased Fat Al's Greg Barber, who was already tackling a 130-metre climb at Lochstock Innis. Dermot McConigal of Where the Fox At held 2nd place on the road. Our third on the road was still Bargett for Wrong Box, still narrowly holding on to 2nd overall though. At the end of the 25-kilometre road bike and 7-kilometre mountain bike, Diamantidis enjoyed a relaxing can of cold spaghetti before tackling Clisham, 640 metres, the tallest peak in the Hebrides. Sadly, this was the last time we saw Mark Laithwaite, soon after he retired with a torn hamstring and had an agonising 3-hour hobble to the nearest checkpoint, which, after the close competition of the past 24 hours, left Diamantidis in an unassailable lead. When Adrian Davis of Where the Fox At arrived at the end of the 20-mile run, his feet bore testament to the toughness of the section that had claimed Laithwaite. And remember, this was just part of the 3-day competition. And there was still an 11-kilometre road cycle before the overnight stop at Uig. It was breakfast on the run for Ben Bardsley of Wrong Box the following morning as he stormed around the southern end of Loch Swainbal to lead on the road and bring hope that his team might overcome the narrow lead held by Fat Al's. But Greg Barber was still shadowing Bardsley and keeping the pressure on. Team Patton was still going strong in 4th and were even closing on Where the Fox Hat. Meanwhile, Bardsley completed the 20-kilometre run to Lochrogue, but despite finishing ahead on the road, Alec Keith chased him in after Fat Al's made a tactical runner swap to allow a fresh pair of legs.
Yes. I think you and Ian ought to give this a go one time, Stephanie, and we'll be the support boat.
Scottish national quadrathlete Maggie Creeber streaked ahead on the 1-kilometre swim across Lochrogue. And following across was Nicola Davis of the Wrong Box team. Such is the speed of the event that just 1 hour later, Davis was in the Hebridean capital, marking a route for the mountain bike section around the grounds of Stornoway Castle. But although Wrong Box still lead on the road, Fat Al's were keeping up a furious pace behind them, as team head Alec Keith swept into Cuddy Point. Katie Bucock took Fat Al's first stint around the circuit that on this occasion had to be completed by 3 of the 4 members of each team. the others, the kayakers, were still halfway through a 17-kilometre sea paddle. After John Bargett, Ben Bardsley took the third stint for Wrong Box, but writing directions on his arm didn't seem to help his sense of direction when he got on the course. And after Alec Keith took the final shift for Fat Al, it was down to some serious map reading to decipher the position of the final mystery checkpoint.
432-506.
Bargett took off first to retain Wrong Box's lead on the road, but they still couldn't break the stranglehold of the Inverness-based Fat Al team. And as the kayakers came in, it became clear that their paddler, Ian Wilson, had added even further time to their lead, which now looked good enough to carry them home, barring disasters. Although the result of the solo race now seemed a foregone conclusion, second place was still very much up for grabs, particularly after Chris McSweeney made a big detour on one of the run sections. But all the while, Diamantides was piling on the pressure and widening the gap with her blistering fell runs. Back with the teams, Ben Bardsley was being caught all the time by Fat Al's. As he handed over to Nicola Davis, Alec Keith of Fat Al streaked away out of shot to surge into the lead on the road as well as overall. So, after twice finishing the bridesmaids, Fat Al had achieved their dream, across the line in unison to win the Deep Heat Western Isles Challenge in a combined time of 45 hours and 32 minutes, a full 15 minutes ahead of the Wrong Box team. Bargett led Wrong Box across the finish line soon after. And Where the Fox Hat came home in third in a time of 48 hours dead. And in the solos, Helen Diamantides stormed home in a time of 35 hours and 59 minutes, a full 5 hours ahead of her nearest rival. That man was Chris McSweeney. He came home in a time of 40 hours and 24 minutes, just 9 minutes ahead of Paul McClintock in third.
This was the hardest Western Isles challenge, I would say, by a chunk. Yeah. I think every day had an extra sort of hour or so's effort in it, and that sort of took its toll.
Oh, thank you. Did you win? I like the running, of course, I'd have to say that. And I really did enjoy the paddling, which for a non-paddler I think is something. I was really worried about crossing the Sound of Harris. You hear all these horror stories, but it was surprisingly okay. I even saw dolphins. That was really nice.
So the Deep Heat Western Isles Challenge came to a fitting finale with the traditional champagne celebrations. But with the sport of adventure racing growing rapidly all the time, the winners are sure of even stronger competition when they defend their titles next year. And that's all for this week. Catch you next time.